The last few days, I've been going through websites for colleges and universities, starting with the United States, getting into the English faculty's bios and pulling out the ones that look like they might possibly be interested in my upcoming paper on Charles Dickens and A Christmas Carol. And then I'm just making a list of those. When that article comes out in Real Paranormal Magazine UK, not Real Paranormal Magazine, they're two different online publications. When it comes out, hopefully in a few days, they're a little bit delayed. Then about a month after that, I'll post it on Academia EDU, and then I'll start sending a link to all of these professors. In the meantime, occasionally I come across one or another that has to do with a specialty that is not related directly to one of these four major plagiarists that I'm writing four papers on, and I'll just write to them directly. So yesterday I wrote to two or three, and one of them did write back. I wrote to her about Matthew's book, The Rag Picker, or Bound and Free, and my frustration about not being able to get anyone to seriously consider changing the official authorship. Well, of course, she wouldn't commit, and she wasn't particularly interested, but she did give me a suggestion to submit a paper to a kind of online clearinghouse. I think it's called Commonplace, connected with the American Antiquarian Society. And I looked at that, and there are no opportunities that I can see to submit anything, although you can write to the founders and people that are running it. So I may do that. But the problem with all that is, this is not the first time that a professor has recommended that I submit an article to one journal or another. And the problem is that if any editor sees the whole picture of my presentation, they're going to balk. And that's true with anybody. If I come off with, I'm the reincarnation of this obscure author who was the real author of A Christmas Carol, or co-author, the real author of The Raven, the real author of most of the celebrated works of Margaret Fuller and four of the poems of Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And I have a master's degree in counseling. I'm not affiliated with academia, and wouldn't you be interested in this? And they're all going to just dismiss it. Naturally, it's understandable. So the only solution is to attack the thing piecemeal and introduce just the Dickens people to Dickens and just the Poe people to Poe and so on. And maybe people who are interested in plagiarism, just some of the minor plagiarists that took credit for Matthew's work. But I'm finding that doesn't work either. For one thing, of course, as soon as they look me up online, they see the whole picture. But for another reason, they're not willing to even change these little things that I can prove outright. I can prove outright that Matthew was the real author of a travelogue signed Quails in the Boston Weekly Museum in late 1849 through 1852. I've got that outright. And there's a number of other things I've got smoking guns for that I can prove outright. Nobody wants to rock the boat, and everybody wants from me, from the fellow that runs the Wikipedia page all the way up to the scholars, they all want references and citations. They want some expert to sign off on it. They want the community of experts to sign off on it. They don't care about the truth. This is the bizarre thing. Truth and evidence, even smoking guns, don't move them. They want social acceptance, peer validation. And I can't give them that because I'm the pioneer. As I've said many times, I'm the guy that discovered something that nobody else found, and I can't give them anybody else. There's a couple, there's a few sources on Mathew Franklin Whittier, and he's portrayed as a literary hack and a person of no great importance in all of those sources. So I can't refer to them, and there's nobody else. So what I do is I keep taking my evidence, my strongest evidence, and I'm a good writer still in this lifetime, so I'm able to put it together very well, and I just keep hammering away at the thing piecemeal. So this first article will just be all the evidence, or most of the evidence, for Mathew Franklin Whittier and his first wife, Abby Poyen Whittier, as the original authors of A Christmas Carol. Meanwhile, what I thought I'd do today is go into this issue of The Rag Picker or Bound and Free, because this is a kind of a, it's not isolated. None of this stuff is isolated, but I can isolate it out as a single instance of Mathew being plagiarized, and I can prove beyond any reasonable doubt that he was the author. And I'd like to get this one established for posterity because it's an outrageous claim that George Burnham has made on this. It's outrageous, it's nonsensical, and it needs to be dealt with. So this is the original copy, which is very hard to come by, of The Rag Picker or Bound and Free. Here's the title page. It has a beautiful dedication. It's unsigned, that nobody signed this book. The dedication says, I've read this before, "To my sister, the firm and unwavering friend of oppressed humanity and of the poor, the unfortunate, and the erring everywhere, this volume is affectionately dedicated by the author." That would be to Elizabeth Whittier, which would be of immense interest to the Whittier historians, if they believe me, because Elizabeth Whittier figures fairly large in the John Greenleaf Whittier legacy, and a dedication of a book of this magnitude to Elizabeth would be huge for them. I mean, there's other things that would be huge for them. I've got stories about Mathew's uncle or told by his uncle that would be fascinating to them. I can't share them. You know, they don't believe me. They don't want anything to do with me. They're scared of me. They think I'm dangerous nutcase, you know. So I can't share these wonderful plums that I would love to share with them. Well, this book starts out talking about various social ills, or portraying various social ills, including poverty and debt and child abuse and alcoholism and debtor's prison, and the characters are reformed here. And then about halfway through, it goes into slavery, and it has, you know, the Underground Railroad, and I mean, it's a very hard-hitting anti-slavery book, something along the lines of Uncle Tom's Cabin, as we'll see it was compared to. So I've got some very careful notes here. I haven't had much sleep. I'm functioning on a quarter of a tank as far as sleep is concerned. But the first thing I want to talk about is George Burnham and the history of George Burnham and Mathew Franklin Whittier. And I have to recap this quickly. It's quite extensive, and I've talked about it before, but I have to bring us up to speed. So in 1835, as near as I can tell, all of this is put together the best I can. Some details could be wrong, but I think I've got it nailed down correctly now. In 1835, Mathew Franklin Whittier began ghostwriting for Francis A. Durivage. The first thing he did was a historical encyclopedia, which I have an original copy of, but I won't pull it out and show it to you. And then in the early to mid 1840s, Mathew ghost wrote a series of short novels, kind of dramatic adventure novels. And they're quite similar. I mean, it's almost as though he would do one and then he would improve on it by doing the next one. It was like, I guess he was selling these. He allowed Francis Durivage to put his own name to them, but he still considered them artistically his own work, and he would go ahead and write another one and kind of improve on the one he did before. So that happened in 1843 to 45, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. And then apparently, as near as I can tell, in 1848, Francis Durivage and his partner, George Pickering Burnham, approached Mathew and offered to buy the rights to publish some pieces from Mathew's portfolio, unpublished work, which went back to, say, 1830, so 18 years earlier. And Mathew, I'm sure, had in mind that he would choose the ones that they could publish, and that maybe they could use their own names on these certain ones, because he was probably very tight for cash. This was near the end of his unfortunate second arranged marriage to Jane Vaughan. He had 3 children. He probably was having, I think he had one on the way in 1848, and he had trouble supporting them. and he desperately needed cash, so he would have agreed to this for their sake. However, they apparently tricked him into signing a contract which gave them the rights to publish the entire portfolio, which they proceeded to do piecemeal. A lot of it went to the Flag of Our Union, which was owned by Frederick Gleason. Some of it went into Gleason's Pictorial, which was also his paper, both of them in Boston. This was in 1849. If you get into the 1849 edition of the Flag of Our Union, which you can find online, I forget which service, Gutenberg may have it. I'm not sure which one has it. Or either that or the Hathi Trust, I think. You will find a great number of articles. Just about every edition has an article by the Old Un or the Young Un or Francis Durivage. And all of those were written by Mathew, stolen from his portfolio. Then it goes on. I think the Spirit of the Times, George Burnham published some pieces in the New York Spirit of the Times and some other newspapers. And they published compilations. Each of them published compilations of these things. One of them I have a reprint here. I can't find an original, but this is Gleanings from the Portfolio of the Young Un, pseudonym, a series of humorous sketches, George Pickering Burnham. It's a very bad copy, but there's what I think the original front cover looked like. This is all, with maybe one or two exceptions. I think one of them was like modified, but this is Mathew Franklin Whittier's work, all of it. So the history of all of this is that there's a number of ways that I can tell that this is Mathew's work. And the primary, and I can also tell that it goes back to Mathew's earliest work. And the way I can tell is by comparing it to what Mathew was writing for the New York Constellation in 1830 through 1832. Now is when we run into trouble, and this is where I have difficulty, because according to historians, all of that work was written by the editor-in-chief, Asa Green. It was not. It was written by Mathew Franklin Whittier, who ran that paper for Asa Green while Green was running his bookstore in New York City. But if I use Mathew's work in the Constellation to prove that George Burnham stole his portfolio going back to 1830, I now have to prove that Mathew was the author of the work in the Constellation. And in order to do that, I have to do other things. And in order to do those, it's all a big interwoven tapestry, which is not to say that it's a delusional system. Now, a delusional system works the same way. It's all internally consistent, but doesn't relate to anything outside. Well, this does. I've got objective evidence, but Mathew hid himself so completely that is very, very difficult. What you have to do is you have to take it back to Mathew's known pseudonyms, which is Ethan Spike. Historians agree that he was the author of Ethan Spike. And you also can take it back to a pseudonym in the Portland transcript of Poins, P-O-I-N-S. And I can prove that that was Mathew's pseudonym in the Portland transcript from 1841 to about 1844, because his brother, John Greenleaf Whittier, wrote him a letter, which is still in existence, in which he talks about it, refers to something that Mathew wrote as Poins for that paper. So therefore, that can definitely be attributed to Mathew. So I've written an article which has to do with the following the breadcrumbs, which is on Academia EDU, which describes precisely how I got from the known to the unknown, from Ethan Spike to Poins to the star or asterisk signature, and then on from there. It's a really important article with regard to Mathew's work. You can find it on my page in Academia EDU. So George Burnham published a vast number of Mathew's stories. Now, one way you know that they go back to 1830 is that one or two of them are racist, which is important for us, and you'll see why in just a minute. But some of the stories in this book, Gleanings, are racist. The reason they're racist is that Mathew would make fun of blacks, kind of an equal opportunity humor, along with Irishmen and the Dutch and French, and he imitated sailors. He loved to imitate these people and make lighthearted fun of them, not vicious fun of any of them, including black people. But it wasn't very long before he realized that, I mean, he was working for the anti-slavery abolition movement, and he realized that any time that he made lighthearted fun of blacks in black dialect, the way that he did of all the other ethnic groups, that the pro-slavery people would make use of that. And to them, their humor was vicious. His was not. But nonetheless, they were using it, and laughing at it in their context, racist context. So I know in politically correct world, one never makes fun of any ethnic group, but we're talking 1830. And Mathew was, he really was pretty kind about the whole thing. It was just whimsical, see? And he didn't have political correctness back in 1830. So I won't read any of those, so I won't offend anybody. But the gist of it is that he included blacks along with all the other ethnic groups that he poked lighthearted fun of. But in 1849, when these things were getting published, this book, I'm not sure when this was published, but it was not too much after that. 1849, yeah, this is 1849. So George Burnham wasted no time in publishing his compilation after he got the money for all of these in the newspapers. See? Mathew in 1849 would never have published that in a million years, and yet it's clearly his work. So the portfolio, he calls this gleanings from the portfolio of the young'un. See, well, it's not his portfolio, but it is gleanings from a portfolio. So it's like an inside joke. So we know that the portfolio that he swindled the rights to went all the way back to 1830 or so. Now, on the back of this, my notes here, I have written a few characteristic phrases that Mathew used to use, and we can go back to, I could search every one of these and find out just how many times Mathew used them, but some are more than others, but you're talking anywhere from maybe 12 or 15 to 120, depending on which phrase it is. But I wrote down a few, and this is by no means exhaustive. The word ardor appears in here, Vermount instead of Vermont, which he used in Joe Strickland. If you've seen my recent blog entry about Joe Strickland is from Vermont. That's in here. Mathew loved the phrase some pumpkins because his nickname was Peter Pumpkin. He loved pumpkin pie, and he was a pistol when he was a kid. So they would call him some pumpkins, apparently. So he loved that phrase. That's in here. He used the variation on the Shakespeare quote, like quills on the fretful porcupine. He had Ethan Spike say, like quills on the fretful concubine. No, like quills on the frightful concubine. The way that Ethan Spike put it. But he used variations on that many times. That's in here. French dialect, Irish dialect is all in here. The name Popkin is in here. Mathew wrote as Peter Popkins for the Boston Weekly Museum. That was after this, I believe, but Popkin was one of Mathew's favorite names that he used off and on. Mathew wrote about hogreaves because a hogreave apparently in a small town was the man, it was a official government position in a small town, and his job was to round up the hogs that got away and became public nuisances. And it amused Mathew so much that when he talked about self-important officials in a small town, he would, go to the hogreave, so that's in here. And then military musters. Mathew quite often made fun of military musters when Mathew, as a Quaker, was exempt, as I suspect. So that's also in this book. So there's that and a whole bunch more, all of these indicators of Mathew's authorship. There's no reason to believe that Charles Burnham could write like that. There's no reason to believe that Francis Durivage could write like that. And it was identical. The stuff that both of them were doing was basically identical because it's all stolen from the same portfolio of somebody else. Their explanation as to why they sounded so similar was that George Burnham was supposedly the protege of Francis Durivage. So they created this fiction that George Burnham was the young un, the protege of Francis Durivage, who was the old un. But Matthew used that phrase, the old un, many times in lots of other works. So that was also one of his favorite phrases. The whole thing is obvious, but you have to see the whole picture. I've just presented like 5% of the evidence. There's a whole lot more. So that's the relationship between Mathew Franklin Whittier and George Burnham. Now, I want to go briefly into the relationship between Mathew Franklin Whittier and William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison was a personal friend and benefactor of Matthew's older brother, John Greenleaf Whittier. We know that. It was Garrison who gave John Greenleaf Whittier his first start, published his first poem, and urged him to get a higher education and so on. Matthew apparently knew him personally as well. I have extrapolated that Matthew worked as a liaison, a direct liaison for William Lloyd Garrison when he wrote as Quails for the Boston Weekly Museum beginning in the fall of 1849. I've gone into that before. I have plenty of evidence for that. We'll just say that appears to have been a pretty close relationship at that time. But I can take this relationship back all the way to 1838 because, trying to get my mouse out of the way, because in 1838, beginning in February, Matthew had launched his own paper, The Monitor in Salisbury, or the Salisbury, Massachusetts Monitor. That you can find online. If you look up, put in Whittier, Salisbury Monitor, you will come up with the Burnham's auction that featured that paper, sold for over $7,000 and has been squirreled away ever since. And I have no idea who purchased it, but they are hiding it from the rest of the world, which I feel is unethical and inappropriate. But in any case, I was able to get into it through the back door because on the genealogy websites, you can search for particular names and newspaper names and so on. And if you search on Salisbury Monitor, you will come up with 4 or 5 hits. And they are instances where other newspapers have reprinted articles from Matthew's paper, The Monitor. And it was chiefly William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator which did that. And I happen to have, as soon as I find what I did with it, I happen to have one example, physical example of that. And I'm going to go ahead and read from that physical example just for a little authenticity here and to show off my collection, but mostly because I really like the authenticity of original sources. And when I say original sources, I mean original sources. This is The Liberator of Friday, March 23, 1838. And on the 3rd page, this is a huge sheet, so I have to be as careful as I possibly can with this. On the 3rd page, I won't try to hold that up. Is an article titled State Agent. There's a hand pointing symbol, and it says, the managers of the Massachusetts A.S. Anti-Slavery Society have secured the services of our brother St. Clair for 1 year. From his well-known zeal and indefatigable spirit, important results may be expected from his agency. We copy the following notice with great pleasure, and it says in italics, anti-slavery, and goes on. Reverend, and it's a little hard to read, I don't have my lighting here, Reverend Allison St. Clair addressed a large audience at the Old Baptist Church on Monday evening last. We had often heard this gentleman spoken of as a lecturer, but our strongest anticipations were more than realized. Now, I've mentioned this before, that Matthew loved this little literary technique of saying that he was pleasantly surprised. He tried all kinds of variations on it, and a couple times he would say he was disappointed, and then he would go on to explain that it was even better than he thought, and that's what he meant by being disappointed. So he loved this phrase. But anyway, we know this is Matthew because it's signed by his newspaper. So I continue. Mr. St. Clair is perfectly original. This is something else Matthew liked, both in manner and matter. His illustrations are the most appropriate and happy imaginable. He diverges widely from the old beaten track of monotony, so common to declaimers, and with wonderful facility conveys his hearers from the argumentative to the ludicrous, from the sublime to the pathetic, thus preserving an interesting variety 1,000 times more effectual than monotonous sublimity or unvarying pathos. He took up and explained the measures of the abolitionists in a clear, lucid manner, severally brought forward, dissected, and scattered to the winds the arguments of their opponents, and at the conclusion gave permission for any who felt disposed to attempt a disproval of his position. Then there's a dash, and in italics it says Salisbury Monitor. That is absolutely, definitely Mathew Franklin Whittier's writing. And at some point I may do another entry having to do with Matthew's reporting, and just keep this in mind that that is Matthew's style. Okay, he starts out in his reviews, he starts out giving you a little synopsis and a little evaluation of the speaker's style, and then he launches into the talk. Here he didn't launch into the talk, he just basically has the introduction. Now, whether there was more in the Monitor, we don't know, because whoever bought the Monitor has squirreled it away and will not release it for historians, myself or anybody else. So, what can I say about that? Other than that, I think it's highly unethical. It's technically legal, but it's highly unethical, and I think it's time for us to pay attention to what is ethical and right, as opposed to just simply what is technically legal. So that's Matthew's relationship with William Lloyd Garrison going back to 1838. And the other point I would make there is that it's very unlikely that William Lloyd Garrison would have just happened to come across this little tiny paper, because Matthew he was funding it out of his own meager pockets, and the runs were probably very small. The distribution was probably small. It failed after a handful of months. And the only way that William Lloyd Garrison would have gotten it, and remember, he reprinted 2 or 3 different articles in it, 2 anyway that I recall, is if Matthew had sent it to him personally. Okay, so there was a relationship between the 2 men as of 1838. And then I've talked about Matthew's extrapolated relationship with William Lloyd Garrison when he was writing his Quails from 1849, 1852. I've mentioned before that if I've interpreted things correctly, William Lloyd Garrison has Matthew talking to Daniel Webster about a month after the Fugitive Slave Act was passed. So he sent him to argue with Daniel Webster. And again, this should tell you something about Matthew. And he had been a member of the Nixian Debating Club in Portland in years past. So William Lloyd Garrison must have trusted Matthew's abilities to send him to argue with Daniel Webster, Now, let's get to Burnham's book. Burnham published a book in early 1855 called The History of the Hen Fever, a Humorous Record. And this is something I did not prepare myself with, although I may put it up on the screen here if I can find it. One of the pieces in Matthew's portfolio that was stolen by Francis Durivage and George Burnham had to do with a particular type of chicken, or raising chickens. There's a particular type of chicken that was it was exotic, and there was a whole bunch of people that got fascinated by it. I think it was originally raised by Queen Victoria, but it was basically worthless. See, so it was a scam. And Matthew wrote a short story about that, and it was taken and published by either Durivage or Burnham, and I'll have to look that up. So that was already part of that portfolio. But apparently George Burnham decided to stretch that one into a book. And apparently he actually participated in the scam. In other words, he ran the scam and then wrote a book about it. Well, Matthew took a very dim view of that. So there's an unsigned review, in the 1855 edition, March 31, 1855 edition of the Portland Transcript, and I have that in original. This is like 2 years worth of the Portland Transcript. And if you will note, I now have some very classy bookmarks. So instead of old ratty pieces of paper now that I've finished most of the important blog entries, I now have very nice little bookmarks. But I'm going to put it up on the screen also, but I'm going to read this as soon as I find it. Here we are. Book notices. Now, I'm convinced that Matthew wrote this. I'm like 100% convinced. Trying to prove it to you would be very difficult. I would have to go back and show you all of Matthew's reviews and his style and so forth and so on. Take it from me, the world expert on Mathew Franklin Whittier, that he wrote this review. If you don't want to do that, well, what can I tell you? The first one under book notices, History of the Hen Fever, a Humorous Record by George P. Burnham, Boston, James French and Company's a publisher. It's very low light, but I think I can read it. Judging from the newspaper notices of this book, some people have found it very amusing, but we confess we have not been able to get up a good, honest laugh over it. The author is certainly in very good humor, as he can well afford to be with $30,000 in his pocket, as the result of his unscrupulous activity in filling the poultry yards of the country with these unprofitable monsters termed Cochin Chinas and Shanghais. He chuckles over his game and his victims with great glee, but the joke seems to us to border a little on the dishonest. The infatuation of the victims of the hen fever was certainly very absurd, and one can but be amused at their extravagance. But the humor of the book is very coarse and slangy, while its morality is more than doubtful. So Matthew panned this thing and exposed him as a con artist. See? That was early in 1855. And no doubt George Burnham noticed it, and no doubt he strongly suspected who the author was. So he had a bone to pick. Now, a review, let's see, let me get to my next page here. The Rag Picker was released later in 1855 in October, and I've read the dedication to Elizabeth Whittier. William Lloyd Garrison reviewed it a week later in the October 12, 1855 edition of The Liberator, and he says, quote, "We have read this work, which claims to be, quote, a record of facts by an eye and ear witness with thrilling interest at a single sitting." 421 pages. It deserves to be placed in the same category with Uncle Tom's Cabin, though not so exclusively devoted to delineations of the slave system at the South. That's because it only picks up that topic halfway through, which means that he read the whole thing at one sitting, the whole thing until he got to halfway where the slavery part started and then finished it. What higher panegyric can we bestow upon it? And then it goes on the dedication and so on. We can add nothing more to his introduction this week, except to express the hope that it will be circulated and read until the last victim of intemperance is rescued and the last slave in our land set free. And then there's a long extract on the last page in this edition, and I think in the subsequent edition, there's another long extract. So it couldn't have been a more glowing review from William Lloyd Garrison. Couldn't possibly have been. And there were other strong reviews. So, and this apparently did pretty well. This is a significant work, historically significant work. I mean, I don't know how you gauge how historically significant something is, but it's up there with Uncle Tom's Cabin, okay? And yet it's been completely ignored. I wrote to this one professor I wrote to who apparently had never heard of it, see? So it's very strange what gets famous and what isn't famous and what's considered important in history and what isn't. The author was never identified. It had its impact on the world William Lloyd Garrison glowingly reviewed it, and it was forgotten except by one person. So apparently, George Burnham was wealthy. Well, obviously, he was if he earned that much from his scams. He may have inherited as well. So he wanted to associate his name with this book. And it infuriated him that Matthew had written something that he didn't have, possession of, that he couldn't attach his name to. So apparently he bought a book-selling company. There was a company called Fetterhen and Company in Boston, and apparently they were just like Publishers Clearinghouse, before he bought them. Then he buys it, it becomes Burnham, Fetterhen and Company, and then apparently he sold it not too long afterwards, so it was only briefly during this period that he was involved in it. He takes out ads in the Boston Herald, which began on December 6th. We're talking 2 months after The Rag Picker was published anonymously by Matthew. And he lists it as one of his books written by himself, in his advertisements for his recently purchased company. This is one hell of a scam this guy's pulling. And then an editor, I don't know if it was the editor, but an editor in the Boston Herald, the same paper that the ads are coming out in, writes, "This volume is from the pen of George P. Burnham, an author and contributor to our periodical literature, not unknown to fame." Well, of course, that's Matthew's work. He stole out of Matthew's portfolio. "It is claimed for the Rag Picker that it is the most able anti-slavery novel since Uncle Tom's Cabin." Then another Boston paper called The True Flag comes out on December 22nd and says, "The Rag Picker, the mystery enshrouding the authorship of this anti-slavery novel from the press of the Mason brothers has been at length cleared up, and George P. Burnham, Esquire, is announced as the author. The volume in question is worthy, quote, a local habitation and a name. The story is interesting and graphically told." Of course, that's all he has to say about it. He's probably another racist. See, all these guys are probably racists. So they don't want to really talk too much about, what it is. All he'll say is it's interesting and graphically told. He won't, So that's all I could find that attaches George Burnham's name to this book. That's it. That brief period, 2 newspapers only in Boston. Whereas this was published in New York City, it was nationwide, right? That's it. So basically, he tried to attach his name to this and failed at the time. But then, in 1890, long after Matthew had passed on, comes History of Middlesex County, Massachusetts, compiled under the supervision of D. Hamilton Hurd. And on page 214, he lists it as George Burnham's book, among others. Then, in 1957, which is 4 years after I was born, comes American Fiction, 1851 to 1875, by Lyle H. Wright. And on page 60, he lists it having probably picked it up from the History of Middlesex County, Massachusetts. So this thing is hopping from one century to another, see? And this is apparently what happens. One person sees it listed somewhere, takes it as truth and puts it in black and white. Somebody else sees that source and assumes it as truth and pushes it forward. What happened is that an acquisitions librarian got hold of one of these books. And my copy actually had George Burnham's name lightly penciled in it, and I very lightly erased it, so it's not there anymore. But she apparently found these references from 1890 and 1957, being busy and wanting to go to lunch, because somebody had invited her to lunch probably, and she really didn't want to spend too much time on it. She said, "Oh, that's the name of that one." Or maybe it was even an intern. We don't know. But somebody penciled George Burnham's name in the front of that book. Then that copy got digitized, and I know that because in WorldCat, if you look it up, you will find that a whole bunch of libraries claim to have an original physical copy. But I wrote to every single one of them, and they all say, no, all we have is a digital copy, except for one librarian. I forget where it was. There's only one person that has a physical copy. They digitized it, sent it digitally to all the other libraries, and they all assumed that it was George Burnham's book. Then the book reprinters, the people that sell these reprinted copies, they got hold of that. And they said, oh, it's George Burnham. So they put his name on there. Now it's fact. It's historical fact. And one dares not touch it. One dares not question it. It cannot be changed. Who has the authority to change it? Where's the citation? Where's the scholarly reference? Well, I've made this case basically to librarians and just recently to a scholar, and nobody will touch it. I don't know if they don't have the guts to deal with it or if they just don't believe me. And of course, if they look into me a little bit, they'll find that I'm the crazy guy that believes he's the reincarnation of the author of The Raven, So they're not going to believe me. But this is a travesty, that George Burnham, the asshole con artist who only briefly got his name associated with it in a couple Boston papers, is now on the blasted front cover of this thing as the author. This guy was almost certainly a racist. He was certainly a crook, and to have written a book like this, that William Lloyd Garrison gave the highest praise and wrote and sat down and read in one sitting, which we're talking like for 12 hours from 6 in the morning to, 6 at night, read a 421-page novel in one sitting, That was written by this racist con artist crook, George Burnham, it can't stand, So that's the best that I can do for it. You can see I feel very strongly about it. I feel strongly about the other ones too. But if you have the theory that the reason that I am claiming that Mathew Franklin Whittier, my past life incarnation, was the author of these famous works, was because I want to puff up my ego, you're off base. I'm telling you, it's a theory. It makes sense initially. If you look into it, that theory does not hold water. That's not what I'm about. I am much more like Jenny Coquelle, who reincarnated to try to bring her past life children together and succeeded, at least for the ones who were still living. That's what I'm doing. I'm trying to bring my literary children back together. And I wrote that to Jenny Coquelle, and she cut off communication, wouldn't talk to me anymore. I offended even her, So apparently, and I offended her because I wasn't entirely sold on the Stevensonian method of reincarnation research as the only method, see? And she apparently would have none of it. So I find myself almost universally rejected, but I've got so much to share, and I think it's of tremendous importance. It's certainly of, dare I say, much more importance than 90% of the research areas that I'm seeing as I go through these professor bios online. The things that they're interested in are nowhere near as significant as what I'm working on and trying to get out to the public and to academia, So that's the Rag Picker. I'm tempted to read a little portion of it to close. It's a novel, so you have to know what's going on. But if I were to open the back part of this at random, I would come to chapter, what is L111? I don't know Roman numerals. I had them in school, but I don't know what they are. Anyway, it's a chapter L111 in Roman numerals. The Stolen Child, and there is a Thomas Pringle poetic quote: "Away, away on bounding steeds, the white man-stealers fleetly go, through long, low valleys fringed with reeds, or mountains capped with snow, each with his captive far and fast." Tascombe had been watching all the next day for the opportunity to get Nora's boy away, but the mother either suspected him or was more than usually watchful while the slave trader was in sight, and it had come to be nearly evening before he made any open attempt at removing Buff. It was getting late, and he had 8 miles to go before he could obtain a public conveyance to the southward, it being his intention to proceed at once to Hopkinsville and down to Cumberland River, whence he could get away with the child without further trouble. So this white man is trying to steal a young black woman's child. He had taken leave of Britain, Brittan, who I think is a character, and the sun had just set. So Tascam came to the side entrance of the house and said, "Hello, Buff, what you doing?" The little fellow started to his feet and went into the kitchen as the trader approached, for Nora had taught him in secret to look upon Tascam as a wicked ghoul, from which he should flee whenever he saw him coming. "Come, Buffy, come," he continued coaxingly, as if he were calling a dog, but the boy looked in his eye and said, "No, I don't want her." "Then I'll have to fetch you," replied the brute, jumping into the doorway ferociously and gripping the boy in his arms. With one hand he seized Buff rudely, and as the boy screamed, "Mom!" the other palm of the slave catcher was clapped upon the youngster's mouth to prevent him from uttering the final syllable when he would have called for Mama. Jumping out of doors with him as quickly and as stealthily as he had come in, he hastened to the rear of the dwelling, where stood a rough, open wagon with a stout horse before it in readiness for a start. That's a little tiny snippet from the Rag Picker. This is Mathew Franklin Whittier's work, the man who'd been working, risking his life for the abolitionist cause since late 1830s, who had worked undercover and in New Orleans, risked his life there covering the slave market and various things, and acting as a liaison with the members of the Underground Railroad down in the South. And it was really based on firsthand knowledge of these things, as he suggested. This is not George P. Burnham, the crook. All right, that's all I have for today. I got to get into the editing program, and we'll see. We had 9. So far, we have 9 people that looked at the one I did most recently, and that is evidence for Matthew's career as a humorist, his literary works as a humorist, and his various characters, starting from 1825, when he originated that genre in America, up until the early 1850s. And it's significant, and that only 9 people would take the time to watch that. It's just amazing. It's as amazing as George P. Burnham being, associated with the Rag Picker. So this is a very strange time right now where, I just have to say it. I'm doing significant work. I'm obviously not the only person doing significant work, but I'm doing significant work, which one retired professor that I hired said that I was doing above PhD level work, and he only saw just a little tiny bit of what I was doing. It deserves some attention. It deserves more than 9 people, honestly. So we'll see what happens. 9's about the cutoff. If I'm getting as many as 9 people viewing these, it's probably worth continuing to make them. When it drops too much below that, because this could be like a day's worth of editing, the rest of my day is going to be taken up. It's now 7:05. Pretty much the rest of my day is going to be taken up editing this. So when you have like 5 people watching, and you're doing a whole day's work, you begin to wonder what the heck you're doing it for. But we shall see. And those of you who are watching, thank you for watching.